So can you give us a sense of what this statement means and whether we should be making more ambitious pitches over metrics in a landscape that reports like this are actually helping to shape?
Yeah, the topic of metrics is really interesting. I think the first thing I'd say is no metric, especially in the world of climate impact, is perfect. And they all have different strengths and challenges to them. Specifically with contrails, it is, I would say if you're trying to understand and make decisions based on should I avoid or not avoid this contrail specifically, then becomes really relevant to think about the shorter time span, a GWP 20 in this case, where you're looking at what is that impact over 20 years as opposed to spread out over 100. You clearly see that impact is much more concentrated. But I think at the end of the day, any measurement, as long as we're using a consistent one, is an improvement and a step forward from where we've been using a number of different approaches here. Everyone's got a different favorite in terms of their metric, depending on where they're coming from or the use case of how they're measuring it. But just fundamentally using a single metric consistently going forward is important.
Welcome to the Aerospace Ambition podcast. I'm Marius, an aerospace engineer and your host. In today's episode, we'll dive into the world of sustainable aviation, focusing in depth on a report published recently on contrail management and its implications for the industry. But first off, I am fortunate to have a co-pilot with me today, Jonathan 𝐥𝐢𝐤𝐻. Jonathan is a postdoctoral researcher at Imperial College London, specializing in the climate impact of aviation-induced condensation trails. Jonathan, great to have you on board.
Thank you, Marius, and thank you for having me. I've been an avid listener to the podcast ever since it came out, so it's great to be here at the other end of the microphone, and I can't wait to get into today's discussion.
Yeah, me too, and the reason for that is that I already know who our guest today is, and I'm sure you're as excited as I am about him. So we have the pleasure of speaking with Andrew Chen from the Rocky Mountain Institute, or short, RMI. Andrew is the principal for aviation decarbonization at RMI, where he leads the aviation team's efforts to accelerate the transition to net zero air transport. With over 15 years of experience in sustainability strategy, environmental impact assessment, and emissions management, Andrew is a passionate and experienced leader in the field of decarbonization. Andrew, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
It's very exciting to have you. And even though our audience is, I'd say, a rather technical audience and familiar with some of the terms that we are discussing here, I know that you have communicational strengths and I want to leverage them. And that's why I asked you a question to just set the scene. And that is, when you speak to a non-technical person, how would you typically explain contrail management in simple terms? And as a follow-up, how would you, in that conversation, differentiate between contrail management and contrail avoidance?
Oh, great question. So typically, speaking to a lot of different audiences with different backgrounds on the topic, which is pretty common in our world, there is a little bit of scene setting that's necessary. So we do need to talk about the fact that there is another climate impact from aviation, a hidden one and not one that's often discussed. And this is the contrail impact, or the radiative forcing, if you will, that comes from the fact that aviation very uniquely makes an impact, or it makes a human-induced cloud at altitude that has a climate impact. So oftentimes we have to start with the fact that aircraft and aviation very uniquely has an additional climate impact. It's hard to measure, but it is a large one. It's significant. And if we're trying to describe the differences between contrail management and avoidance, the way that I would describe that is that contrail management is the full suite of all the tools and strategies available to us to help reduce the impact, the climate impact of contrails. And contrail avoidance, in our view and the way that we've been understanding and studying and working with the industry on this, is the major lever that we have to implement any kind of contrail management. So when I say contrail management is a bigger umbrella term, that then scoops in things like the engine settings, and exactly, how that engine from the aircraft is combusting fuel and creating soot or fewer particles, which would help with contrail persistence and contrail formation. It could also have to do with the concept of lower aromatic fuel or higher hydrogen content fuel, which includes sustainable aviation fuel or renewable aviation fuel, has, we believe, and studies show a lower contrail impact as well. But fundamentally, we look at contrail avoidance or navigational avoidance, the process of predicting and avoiding contrail-prone regions of the altitude or of the sky, as the major tool available to us. So I think in terms of orders of priority or orders of magnitude, contrail avoidance is going to be the highest up there in terms of the ability to reduce contrail impacts. And from our thinking, then you add on an additional benefit from utilizing low aromatic or sustainable aviation fuel. And then another add-on to that is the engine technology that's burning that fuel. But the first order effect is really from, can we avoid flying through a part of the sky that would create a persistent warming contrail?
So in July of this year, 2024, you published a collaborative study on contrail management, as Marius mentioned in the introduction. So I guess to start us off on that, could you share the title of the study with our listeners? Say which partners were involved and how long it took to prepare, because it's quite an extensive document.
Yes, it was. It's quite a labor of love. We're very excited to have that published now toward the end of July here, and a lot of great, kind of follow-on conversations and next steps coming from this. But the name of the report, which you can find online at rmi.org, is Understanding Contrail Management: Opportunities, Challenges, and Insights. And I think, we hope and we believe that it does what it says on the tin. In terms of what our approach was to try and pull together a comprehensive resource to understand the latest best practices in terms of contrail management in real world trials that are happening today are quite exciting, but also to understand the challenges, where the current understanding of science is, where the next steps are in terms of research, and then also to think through what are the challenges and opportunities in terms of how this scales up, and where this goes. We were incredibly lucky to work with a number of contributors across the Contrail Impact Task Force. So just a quick word on that. The Contrail Impact Task Force, it was founded by RMI about 2.5 years ago. It is meant to be a broad convening platform across that entire value chain of aviation, research, technology, to help understand, share best practice, and create more awareness and more acceleration of these solutions that are under development. So it's got about 60 to 65 organizations, again, airlines, manufacturers, air traffic controllers, research institutions, software developers, flight planners, other NGOs, fuel producers, so on and so forth. So we really are a growing, broad convening platform that we're excited to have stood up and have a network to share best practice and learn more from, but also inspire more action outside. The report itself, which is quite in detail and comprehensive, could not have been done by ourselves alone. So one thing we have to recognize is that RMI is an expert in the clean energy transition, in decarbonization, and renewable energy and efficiency. But contrails and navigational flight avoidance is not an area where we hold a huge amount of technical expertise. So we rely on the Contrail Impact Task Force participants and contributors to help us with the science. And we were very lucky to have a number. So to help us in terms of co-authoring the paper that was just published, in addition to authors from RMI, we had authors from Yale, we had authors from the International Council on Clean Transportation, from 𝐥𝐢𝐤𝐤, a startup working in the contrail management space, from the University of Maine. We also had folks from Roland Berger, who are a consultant who work in sustainable aviation as well as other sustainability themes. Breakthrough Energy have been a massive, important player in this space, and I'm sure we'll be talking about their team and the work that they do to predict contrails. We also had folks from Columbia and from NAT, so formerly the National Air air transport system provider, or NAT, which is the UK air traffic controller in England. So really fantastic group of experts to help us draft individual sections, run some analyses, but also to help share the pen, because like I said before, we don't own all of this information. We don't claim to own any of this. What we're trying to do is collate this in a singular resource and help convene these conversations and move action forward.
Right, and you've mentioned a lot of partners, and I could now spell out all the episodes where we had some of these people already on the show, but I'm going to spare us. However, those are the kinds of people who also go to events such as the Contrails workshop, which took place in June. And that's also where we met in person, Andrew. And I remember at the end of the second day, there was a small group exercise where, the entire audience was split up in groups, and we were in the same group, and our task was, and we even got, the little template here. I still have it here, where we had to summarize our takeaways and what we've learned, what opportunities are, risks are, and what we need to do. And you did a great job then presenting the results of our group. And what I took away from all of the presentations of the small groups was that the big issues were around the uncertainty of predicting persistent contrails, but also the challenges of scaling contrail operations. Now, since that was already known to the group of experts, the large group, more than 100 people were there, I think, since this was already known at the time, what is the groundbreaking thing that came out of this study that you published in July? So what was the thing the research revealed which was previously unknown?
It's hard to say if there was anything groundbreaking or exclusive in terms of findings, but I think there were, for me, let me just say from a personal standpoint, coming out of the sessions that the Contrail sessions that Breakthrough Energy and Google hosted, for me, one of the biggest things coming out of that, and also from the report, really is the opportunity in front of us here. So the challenge is well understood, and it definitely benefits us to study and understand the complexities of the challenge, especially on scaling, on the academic research, and trying to pin down a higher degree of certainty of the impact of contrails, and also a higher ability to predict when we would make a persistent warming contrail. But really what came out for me was the amount of momentum and passion and expertise that are around the globe working on this topic. But also a lot of times not accusing anyone of not being, able to break out of their silos or to create better connections. But typically we see, when folks go deep on an issue, they may not have the best landscape vision of who else is working on something, how that may fit into industry trials, how industry trials may support research that's happening, and how all this work relates to policy that's under consideration and discussion right now. So I think one of the real eye openers for me was on, again, the amount of attention and work on this topic and the amount of expertise that exists. But then the follow up to that is the need to continue collaboration, continue that close working together so that we can move faster and further together than we could alone individually. But I think the second thing was, if you're in this world of sustainable aviation, which I've been in for most of my career, a lot of that work is focused, rightly so, on how do we create a market for SAF, sustainable aviation fuel, that's lasting, with high integrity fuels and feedstocks that can address many of the issues that we're trying to deal with today. You don't often have a solution that is incredibly concentrated or cost effective necessarily. So oftentimes we look at the cost of SAF, it's 2 to 4 times more expensive than fossil fuel today. You look at the R&D research, certification costs of a new electric or fuel cell aircraft, they're staggering. They're large numbers. Alone, when we look just at SAF, and really what would be necessary for the industry in terms of production facilities of renewable fuels and renewable energy of the future, out to 2050, the stat is on average, we need to see investment of $175 billion US annually from now until 2050 to be able to create the infrastructure and the new fuels and energy sources of aviation to hit net zero targets. So that's a staggering number, and it's one that we can't by any means take our foot off of the pedal in terms of trying to accelerate our arrival of new markets and of new technologies. But when we think about contrails, again, the uncertainties exist. But if aviation emits roughly a gigaton of carbon dioxide every year, the contrail impacts may be equivalent to that gigaton on a yearly basis. They may be less than, they may be double, but it tells me that it is a significant source of aviation climate impact. And then when we start digging into the actual root of the problem, comparatively speaking, it's an incredibly concentrated number of flights that create the vast majority of these warming impacts and these warming contrails. So you've got a concentrated problem where you can target a solution much more effectively. And then when you start to begin looking at costs, we work the team at Roland Berger did a great job of beginning to analyze some initial CapEx and OpEx costs related to this and compare this. It's not appropriate to compare it side by side with SAF because these are two different challenges that you're trying to solve, so you can't really see them as interchangeable. But it looks vastly more cost efficient than SAF. And even when you compare this just to the social cost of carbon, let's say, for the more academic approach of what does it cost society for any one industry or activity to emit a single ton of carbon, when you compare it to those costs, again, much lower. So, still more work is going to be needed to help develop these systems and to really understand the investment costs and the operational costs that would be necessary. But even when you throw incredibly conservative numbers at this, you're looking at a very attractive cost in a world where, typically speaking, what we usually use the term marginal abatement cost. So the comparative cost of investing $1 into SAF or $1 into hydrogen, aviation, or electric, it is incredibly more competitive when you look at contrail avoidance and navigational avoidance specifically. So a really exciting, promising opportunity, one with challenges in front of it that we need to continue working on. But I came out of this process with an incredible confidence in our ability as a group of organizations, as an industry, as a value chain, to come up with these solutions and put them in place. And that's what's really exciting. So, again, back to the comparisons with SAF, huge costs, huge challenges that we're making great strides in trying to stand up a new market here, but also longer time frame. So again, back to the benefits and opportunities of contrails. Once we're able to scale up these solutions and really have an aligned vision of how to implement this and put this into play, that scale up from being able to address just a small trial number of flights and trial number of contrails to the vast majority can be incredibly rapid. So again, another thing that we often don't see in the world of decarbonization, of heavy industry, of heavy transport, of activities where we used to call them hard to abate. We try to be a little bit more optimistic, but the phrase exists for a reason. These industries don't have easy alternatives to produce less carbon. And so again, back to the original point, we have to view these two things as separate but related issues that need to be solved in parallel. So the reason I say that is it's really important that we don't consider contrail management and any reduction of our contrail impact as something that we can trade off for the carbon reductions that we need to see. So we need to reduce pollution and emissions from aviation directly to net zero by 2050. And in addition, we need to work in parallel on scaling up contrail solutions, because fundamentally, when we talk about hitting net zero aviation and our targets for SAF and electric and hydrogen, those are only looking at direct emissions and direct pollution. They are not yet incorporating or looking at the additional hidden impact of contrails.
So you've touched there on the importance of contrails and contrail management, but also the opportunity that we have for addressing this big climate issue. But often when I talk to my friends or even colleagues within the science and academia, it's not a very well-known topic. So with this in mind, sort of why has RMI and the Contrail Task Force gone for this kind of technical report? And is it a basis for a sort of a wider public awareness campaign, especially in light of sort of recent decisions on the scope of the EU MRV and things like that?
Yeah, I think communications are an incredibly important challenge and opportunity in this space of contrails as well. And it's a great question because our primary audience with the document and generally our work today is not the general public yet. I'm very happy for us to have conversations and for us to have the resources to be able to have these conversations and communicate on a slightly more broad basis. But our primary audience is the aviation value chain right now, because fundamentally what we believe and what many of the task force participants also see, first of all, there is a communication gap, even within experts within the aviation industry. They may not have an atmospheric chemistry background. They may not have been that aware of the term contrails for too long. They have a rough understanding of it, but they don't have a really solid foundational knowledge base of the current science, the current industry action, what next steps are going to look like. And so that's a really important stakeholder set for us right now. It is within the value chain because we need to see more alignment, more collaboration, more awareness, more capacity building within the aviation industry and the NGOs, the tech developers, the researchers that work in this space as well. But fundamentally, there is a communication challenge and a communication and understanding gap that exists today. We've done some really basic research looking at, trends in Google search terms. And I think one of the most shocking things to me, and maybe not to many listeners, but perhaps to some, is that the term chemtrails, the misguided and not scientifically founded conspiracy theory that still exists and persists within many parts of society, is searched far more often than the term contrails is searched. And then when you start to look within some of the research, and there's been some studies looking at the communication challenges and keywords and things, it's really clear that there's still just a basic fundamental understanding gap between what people know or think that they know about contrails and radiative forcing and so-called non-CO2 effect. And that to us says that there is a significant need to help establish a level playing field of understanding. And that's really what the report is intended to provide as a resource.
And especially because still we can't reach the broader public with this. We are not there yet. I'm wondering, researchers, from my perception, play a very important role right now. It's a very researchy topic still. And therefore, I'm always asking myself, shouldn't researchers, I know it's super important that, there is a certain rigor and there are certain rules for researchers to put out their work. And be neutral, that is really important, and especially because at the end of the day, it needs regulation for anything to be really implemented. How do you see the role of researchers in this? Do you think that it's exactly important that they remain so neutral, or could they also play a different kind of role where they more directly address, the topic of regulation as well?
I think I see a little bit of both happening, but fundamentally, I agree with your point that I think the integrity of academic research and scientific understanding is paramount. And if we play that out in this example in terms of contrails, the challenge that we have is it's difficult with a high degree of certainty to pin down what was the impact of aviation contrails last year. It's even more difficult to pin it down to what was the aviation impact of contrails from this single flight yesterday, or the flight that will happen in 4 or 5 days' time becomes even more difficult. So the reason that is quite important is that ultimately you're talking about decision making and trade-offs. When we look at contrail management and specifically contrail avoidance, where you're talking about changing the flight trajectory, many cases changing the altitude slightly, in some cases changing the lat long of a flight path to avoid a contrail prone region, that comes with trade-offs. And the primary one that we see today is additional fuel burn. So additional fuel burn means additional emission. Now, if you want to do that to avoid a significantly warming contrail, you have to have a solid confidence that what you've done to avoid that contrail, which produced additional pollution and additional warming, was overall a good thing to do, that it vastly outweighed the impact that you were avoiding by avoiding that contrail region. So the certainty of the number to pin all of contrails or a single flight to becomes really important when you start to think about decision making. Do I do it on this flight today, tomorrow, next month? Do I try and avoid this contrail or not? Is it not worth it? So the less certainty we have, the more difficult it is to make those decisions, and the more conservative one would have to be to make sure that they are not creating more pollution and burning more fuel.
Yeah.
And then find out later on that actually the contrail they thought they were avoiding, they still made, or the contrail they thought they were avoiding actually wouldn't have been a warming contrail or a persistent one. So the certainty is really important. The academic integrity to get us to that scientific understanding is, I think, a key foundational element. But the second part of your question in terms of how do we use this, how do we get more directly, up the chain to help inform policymakers to make supportive or efficient policies in this space? It is an interesting one. And I think that's where civil society and other groups that are looking at that academic research and helping to understand, expand that thinking, it is helpful right now, but it is early days. So it's a challenging one because really a message to a policymaker is not, hey, this industry is ready to go. We have a solution that's ready to press play on tomorrow, which I wish I could say. And I wish after coming through, writing this report, we could say that with strong confidence, but we have to be cautious. We have to recognize that there are some challenges and gaps in our understanding that are solvable and that we need to work on in tandem. But we can't provide too much of a sense of certainty in terms of, this approach scaled up looks like this, and therefore we're ready for this policy or that policy. So it is a little bit early right now. And there's, understandably, I would say a bit of anxiety within the industry right now because aviation exists within a global network, huge amounts of regulations, huge complexity of patchworks of regulations and policy and cost that these airlines have to navigate and have to be able to operate within. And so when we're still in an understanding phase and a coming up with our plan and getting our vision together phase, I think it can be a little bit daunting to know that policymakers are paying attention and really interested in this issue, which is great to know about as well. But it can, I think, be a little bit a little uncomfortable at times, especially for folks who are in that industry position, who are in between wanting to do good, supporting the research, supporting the trials, thinking about how they can make a real impact here, but also knowing that the outcome from a policymaker could be really damning and challenging to their operations.
Yeah.
So the biggest case in mind is right now there's still a real challenge of how do we measure the impact of a single contrail? How do we account for that and report for that? How do we set targets based on that? It's not easy. That the models are under development in terms of being able to come up with much more consistent information. But if you're thinking about this from the other end of the spectrum as a policymaker, you might just say, oh, it's too difficult to really measure this. But we could just put a multiplier on top of all these flights. So your flight burned, let's say 10 tons of carbon for this flight. We're just going to add a 1.8 or a 2.2 multiplier on top of that. And now we've accounted for the additional contrail impact. But what we haven't done is actually created any incentive to change behavior, because if every single flight is penalized for the same level of contrail impacts, it doesn't give any incentive for that flight to change its operations, to use a different fuel, to reduce its impact overall. And it also creates some distortion within the airline industry. So think about the fact, we know that the vast majority of contrail impacts come from long haul overnight flights at times of year when the air is cold and humid. So if that is really concentrated on those small number, that let's say 5% of global flights that cause 80% of the contrail warming, you're spreading that penalty out across every single flight and airline in the world. So then that means when you look at a smaller regional airline, they're going to have, typically speaking, lower relative levels of contrail impact. They don't have long flights, they don't have overnight flights often. And so they're, in theory, if you just do a flat multiplier, they're paying the penalty of their much larger airline. So you have the market distortions that could be created by that, which we're obviously very eager to understand in more detail.
I'm glad that you really put yourself in the shoes of the policymaker here as well, and draw some of the conclusions from the report already. I think it's that language that is a missing piece of the puzzle here, right? Aside the research papers that you translated into a clear language. And another very clear question, maybe you could answer it briefly. It's a point that Alejandro Bloch from IATA made on this podcast in episode 10, for anyone interested, where this trade-off about certainty. One could come to the conclusion, and I'm paraphrasing here the point of Alejandro, and he even questioned the scientific certainty to a point where he said, well, given the current level of scientific certainty and also the success rate of previous trials, some may argue in the industry that even conducting trials is too much, that even the certainty is not even reached to do trials. How do you think about this conclusion?
I think I respect Alejandro greatly and would love to talk about the kind of the sensors and the humidity data that is really foundational to advancing the certainty as well. But would agree to disagree on the point that even trials right now would be harmful. So I think if knowing that we have degrees of uncertainty, high degrees of uncertainty in terms of the total climate impact of a single flight versus all of aviation over a year, still tells me no matter how conservative you want to be to reduce that uncertainty as much as you possibly can, that there is a significant but solvable challenge in front of us with contrails. That to me, because we've known about this issue for decades, right? Contrail impacts are not a new topic by any means to the aviation industry. The nuances of it, the latest and greatest understandings and mitigation options are newer, and therefore that's a lot of our focus in the report. But the fundamental scientific principle that human-induced clouds create additional warming impacts is not new. So to me, there is a massive need to develop solutions and improve model prediction certainty or the climate warming certainty of contrails. And the only way to do that is with scaled up real world and desktop based studies. So we're very much in the phase of we have to get out there and do real trials in the world to understand, do our models predict accurately? And also, can we take that information and that new flight data and ingest that into our flight planning system efficiently so that we're not creating a massive amount of disruption? How could we handle that with air traffic controllers? So I think there are operational solutions that are being trialed right now. In parallel to that, there's fundamental scientific research of what is the impact of a single or a group of contrails. And then in the middle is how do we predict with a high degree of probability when a warming contrail would be made on a future flight today or next month or whenever that may be. All three of those things can advance in parallel. And even if let's say we're lagging behind on one of those three things, it is still hugely valuable for the aviation community to understand, just give it any information about, okay, there's an issue in the flight ahead of you for contrails. How would you deal with that new change of flight path? Of how would you ingest that information? What does that mean for how this works and is managed by air traffic controllers? So huge benefit from working on this issue, testing it in the real world. The last thing I'll say is, in terms of the total number of trials, and even when we look at scaling up the next phases of trials that our friends at Breakthrough and Google and other airlines are working on getting kicked off very soon here, we're still talking about an incredibly small number of flights compared to the total activity of aviation. And within that, we are still looking at very small single percentage additions to fuel burn on those test flights. So I think for me, even being, adding a level of conservatism to these uncertainty numbers to help with your decision making and to help with your trade-off evaluations, in addition to knowing that it is a hugely important problem for us to work on, all those things add up to me to say that there is a huge amount of value in testing and trialing.
So you've mentioned a few times that sort of the importance of how we measure the contrail impact, and then also how we build that into successful and effective policy. And given that, there's a particular quote in the report that stood out to me, which was, given the prominence of GWP 100, which is global warming potential, in corporate accounting and international treaties, it seems to be inescapable for the purposes of airlines' external climate impact accounting. Now, I, for one, was a little bit sorry to hear this, I would say, given some of the limitations of GWP as a metric, and particularly its consequences of using 100 years as time horizon with regards to meeting 2050 climate goals and 1.5 degree tipping points. So can you give us a sense of what this statement means, and whether we should be making more ambitious pitches over metrics in a landscape that reports like this are actually helping to shape?
Yeah, the topic of metrics is really interesting. I think the first thing I'd say is no metric, especially in the world of climate impact, is perfect. And they all have different strengths and challenges to them. Specifically with contrails, it is, I would say if you're trying to understand and make decisions based on should I avoid or not avoid this contrail specifically, then becomes really relevant to think about the shorter time span, a GWP 20 in this case, where you're looking at what does that impact over 20 years as opposed to spread out over 100. You clearly see that impact is much more concentrated. But I think at the end of the day, any measurement, as long as we're using a consistent one, is an improvement and a step forward from where we've been using a number of different approaches here. Everyone's got a different favorite in terms of their metric, depending on where they're coming from or the use case of how they're measuring it. But just fundamentally, using a single metric consistently going forward is important. And because we have this precedent set by UNFCCC and other accounting and guidance, regulatory and guidance setting bodies, we're not trying to create a whole new thing to work into that. And I think part of that is just the pragmatism of knowing that ship has already set sail. We could try to divert it and turn the entire world of accounting and reporting around to accommodate for this, or we could recognize, yes, there's some trade-off, but we're still making a massive advancement by recommending that we stick to a single metric.
Yeah, that's definitely an understandable point of view here. And of course, the metric is important, not just to quantify, but also to take action eventually. And this leads us to wrap up the episode with an interesting question regarding the MRV. And I need to give a couple of sentences background here. So MRV stands for monitoring, reporting, and verification. And essentially, it's the basis for accounting, how aviation is impacting the environment. And it's an interesting topic. And we've had Joe Dardenne on from Transport and Environment already, Finlay Escher from Safe Landing, Ewan Mitchinson from EasyJet, for example, and also the aforementioned Alejandro Bloch from IATA. And these people have been key voices in an intense debate, I'd say, that took place especially in the month of July. And why was the month of July so important? Well, I think one LinkedIn post of Dimitar Nikov from the European Commission captured it well when he had a call to action within his LinkedIn post that said, the MRV of aviation non-CO2 was published for consultation on the Have Your Say website until 29th of July. So go ahead and have your say. And then he even shared the link for everyone to have their say in regard to the MRV. So what I'm saying here is that the month of July was important because, essentially one could have an impact by at least stating, their opinion. And what I was surprised about was because the report is so extensive and the report is, I mean, who would be a better, consortium to work on these topics and to prepare recommendations? And what I was missing in the report was a clear recommendation regarding the scope of the MRV with regard to non-CO2 effects, because that was the debate essentially. Are we measuring the non-CO2 effects only from intra-European flights or even beyond? And excluding, a certain fraction of flights would of course lead to less data. So that was the key debate. I had to explain it very verbosely here, but just to give that context here. I'm sure this was a discussion point within the consortium and the partners of the report. So how did you get to that conclusion not to make a clear recommendation in that very significant month?
Yeah, it is definitely a very important conversation and topic right now. And I think, so first off, the Contrail Impact Task Force, it's not in itself a lobbying or advocacy organization or platform. So we fundamentally take our inspiration from the ability to advance understanding, share best practice, and accelerate solutions within the space. And so in a lot of ways, we consider the report that we've produced as a resource for policymakers to help understand the nuance and the latest, greatest, and really get a very in-depth scene setting of what is going on in the space right now. But we refrain from making any specific comments. As a non-advocacy or non-lobbying organization, we wouldn't ever really want to comment on a specific policy and a specific consideration. But what can, as RMI, I think it's very easy for me to say a few things. And one is that fully support regulation that helps to decarbonize and address the aviation or the climate impact of aviation. That is easy. Questions about scope, without commenting specifically on who said what about what scope should or shouldn't be included. When you look at aviation, one of the fundamental challenges is that it is a global activity. It's a global network and system. So creating these boundaries of the European Union or specific countries within there becomes really difficult. And then when you layer on the aspect of the impact and the climate targets from aviation are set at an international level and are implemented through that international UN body, ICAO, it becomes tricky when you start having sub-regional state-level policies that add up to it. So by no means am I saying that, I don't want to see policy movement and support and evolution that will help to incentivize change here in this industry. But I think in a lot of ways, we see the benefit of and the challenges of it happening at a centralized level. That being said, there are so many parallels in aviation between SAF and contrails. And generally speaking, as we know, that generally the public and policymakers in Northern and Western Europe are going to be a lot more advanced on environmental topics than the rest of the world a lot of times. So we saw the original early net zero aviation targets coming out of Sustainable Aviation UK, coming out of groups within Europe, then working their way into international conversations. So I see some similar parallel here generally with contrails and international coordination. And it makes me excited because I know that process can work. And so, in a lot of ways, don't want to get involved in specifically one policy or this policy or that, want to see things moving on. And, back to what benefit can we provide? We can help to convene these stakeholders, help to raise awareness, help to generate some consensus and alignment, and therefore create a really useful single resource point for folks like policymakers to look at.
You certainly achieved that goal. And we already in the discussion before this recording, Jonathan and we really praised, for example, the illustrations. That's also something, a good means of communication. And I think they will be cited going forward very often, very frequently. One last question, maybe you could answer it briefly. Professor Paul Williams from the University of Reading was on on the previous podcast, and he asked the following question, puts everything in a nutshell maybe, but currently CORSIA only focuses on CO2, and he's asking when will we have reached a point where, you know, the certainty around forecasting contrails, their radiative forcing is advanced enough to include these non-CO2 effects in CORSIA. I mean, in a way, we've answered, you know, many aspects already, but maybe you could just put it in a nutshell.
Yeah, so CORSIA comes from 𝐾𝐨, the UN body for international aviation, which is a formal UN body. So fundamentally, when you ask yourself the question of how long would it take for this to get incorporated here, it's very similar to asking the question, how long would it take to incorporate something at the UN level? Because ultimately you have, you know, almost 200 member states individually voting to ratify or support a proposal that comes through 𝐾𝐨. But all that being said, I am cautiously optimistic that within the next cycle that we're in right now, that we're going to make a lot more advancement in understanding how one could adopt metrics and incorporate and address non-CO2 or contrail impact, even in light of the uncertainty that we're faced with. But it is a formal international treaty process. So I think you do have to recognize and appreciate that that is not as easy as a letter signing campaign of getting, you know, 50 folks to sign up and say, we want to do this thing too. It takes quite a lot to get those member states across the line and to have those backroom negotiations and conversations. I wish that it didn't, but that is the world of climate politics that fundamentally exists within.
Right. So we've spoken a lot about certainty. I have very high certainty regarding our next podcast guest. And these guests will come from Lufthansa Systems. And that is Benedikt Anweiler and Jonas Sperling. So two experts from Lufthansa Systems. And in the tradition of the podcast, you can also pass on a question to them, just as Paul Williams passed on a question to you. So to these two experts, what could be a good question?
You know, I would love for you to get into the question of how do they see what does the end state look like? Assuming we've understood the uncertainties, the trade-off, the fuel burn, how does that actually look in the future? Because in my mind, what we see today is individual airline operators on a small number of flights decide on the day, do I try this or not try this avoidance? Ultimately, when you see that at a scaled-up version, or when you have a time of year and a piece of airspace with a lot of potential contrail warming impact, how does that get managed? So ultimately, my mind jumps forward to there's got to be a certain level of coordination at air traffic control. But there's pros and cons to this. So that would be a question that I would ask them in terms of how do you see the balance between operator initiated versus ANSP managed contrail avoidance as things scale up in the future?
And as a final point, is there a guest that you would like to see on the podcast? This could be from the policy world, the technical world, the academic world, or any sort of stakeholder.
Ooh, who would I love to see up there? I would, you know, I think it may be interesting to talk to someone from government, specifically innovation, research, and funding side of things. We know that, you know, obviously there's an innovation challenge in the EU, which is being applied here. But fundamentally, we know that just more support and more research is needed on these basic atmospheric chemistry questions of how much does this level of soot in emissions add to radiative forcing, or what is the real climate impact at these altitudes? So I think that would be an interesting one for me, is to try and think about how the government and policymaker side of things is thinking about their priorities for supporting research and advancing science here.
Right, that's a tough one, but we'll take it on. And Andrew, before we thank you, let's thank Jonathan for making a great first appearance here on the podcast. So Jonathan, great job. Thanks for the smart questions, for the preparation for this interview, and for being here today.
Thank you very much. It's been a great experience, and it's been great to hear your thoughts, Andrew, as always.
Yeah, Andrew, I mean, this was a great interview, and you've answered tough questions, and I think this episode provides a lot of value for our audience. So yeah, thanks for being here. Just before we leave off, something I want to get out there. If you enjoy what we do here in our free time, then we would greatly appreciate if you could just follow us, or if you're on Spotify or on Apple, for example, if you could give us a rating. That really helps others to discover the podcast as well. This is our 31st episode here, so also proud to have reached this point, and we are really eager to drive this forward with great guests such as Andrew Chen today. So Andrew, thanks for being on the show, and speak soon.
Real pleasure. Thanks so much.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.